In this presentation, I'm not going to look at any particular organ system. I'm going to look at cells and in particular how they can adapt to altered conditions. We'll see what type of adaptations they can exhibit and what happens if these adaptations aren't enough to allow the cell to operate under the altered conditions. In particular, we'll mention the concepts of cell injury and death. Normally, the cells of our body operate within fairly narrow ranges of physiological conditions. The range a cell can operate in is determined by factors such as its genetic programming, the availability of metabolic substrates such as nutrients, the influence of surrounding cells. If the cell operates effectively, it should achieve a state called homeostasis, a stable state, where the cells are operating effectively in their location. However, often cells are exposed to increased physiological demands, stress, or disease-producing agents. In these situations, the cells may be able to adapt to the new situation. If they cannot, they risk becoming injured or even dying. This shows an example of cells adapting to increased physiological demand. It's in skeletal muscles. This guy here has decided to take on some weight training. He's going to put on extra weight loads onto his muscles. The muscles will respond by increasing the size of the individual skeletal muscle cells, as we can see over here. Bigger cells can cope with bigger loads. As a consequence, the whole muscle gets bigger, as seen here on the right, as the individual skeletal muscle cells get bigger. This is not an abnormal situation. It's perfectly normal. It allows the cell to cope with the increased demands put upon them. This increase in cell size is called hypertrophy. There are a number of ways that cells can adapt to altered demands or stress. Firstly, we have atrophy, a reduction in cell size. Hypertrophy, an increase in cell size. Hyperplasia is where there is an increase in cell numbers. Metaplasia is where one normal cell type is replaced with another normal cell type. Metaplasia comes from the Greek word denoting change in form. A less desirable type of change is dysplasia. This word comes from the Greek term meaning bad formation. The cells here may be indicative of precancerous changes. They're non-reversible. It's important to note that if the adaptation is not enough for the new conditions, the cells may become injured or even die. I'll discuss some of the ways that cells can adapt over the next few slides. One of the most significant cellular adaptations is atrophy, as shown here. This is where we have a shrinkage in the cell size. Here we have the original state, and over here, atrophy has occurred. The individual cells have become smaller. Atrophy may occur as a consequence of several factors, such as reduced physiological demand, reduced nutrition, or a loss of innervation. It can affect any organ, but it's most commonly seen in skeletal muscle, the heart, sex organs, and brains. Two types of atrophy have been described. Simple atrophy, where there is a decrease in the size of the cells, and numeric atrophy, where there is a decrease in the size of the organ due to a reduction of the number of cells within that organ. Now, atrophy may reflect a normal adaptation to changed circumstances. However, it can also indicate underlying problems. This highlights what I've just said. Atrophy can occur for a number of reasons. It can occur due to a decreased workload. For example, stopping a program of lifting heavy weights will cause a reduction in the size of skeletal muscles. This is not a disease issue. Muscles can also get smaller if they lose their nerve supply. This happens in a condition called polio, where a virus destroys the neurons that innervate the skeletal muscle. Without innervation, the muscles stop working and the cells undergo shrinkage, leading to shrinkage or atrophy of the whole skeletal muscles, as seen in this photo of a sufferer of polio. Tissue compression can also cause atrophy. For example, growth of a tumor can compress blood vessels that supply a tissue. This reduced blood supply can then lead to atrophy in the organ. This slide shows atrophy occurring in the brain due to compression from hydrocephalus. That is where there is excessive accumulation of cerebral spinal fluid. Over here we have a normal brain. Note the ventricles where the cerebral spinal fluid is. Over here we have a sufferer of hydrocephalus. This is where there is some blockage in the draining of the fluid and the fluid accumulates. As it accumulates, it will compress the surrounding brain tissue, leading to atrophy. Hypertrophy refers to an increase in cell size as shown in this image. So note here the original cells, and over here the cells have increased in size. Now this increase in size is not due to swelling of the cell. It's due to synthesis of new cellular components, and in particular protein. Cells of skeletal muscle, the heart, the kidneys are particularly prone to hypertrophy. Hypertrophy may reflect a change in demand. For example, skeletal muscles enlarge when extra demands are placed upon them. Hormones can also induce an increase in cell size. For example, each month in females, the ovarian hormone estrogen stimulates cells lining the uterus to enlarge in preparation for pregnancy. This shows examples of hypertrophy. Both examples are normal adaptations and not representative of any pathology. Up top here we can see where hypertrophy has occurred in skeletal muscles. This allows the body to lift bigger weights. Down here we have hypertrophy in the uterus. This has occurred in response to ovarian hormones associated with pregnancy. In particular, what will be happening here is smooth muscle cells in the lining of the uterus will enlarge to cope with the extra demands of the pregnancy. And as I mentioned before, this is under the control of hormones. Hypertrophy can also indicate disease. In particular, much of our understanding of hypertrophy has come from studying heart disease. There are several conditions that place an increased load on the heart, such as faulty valves, or hypertension, or death of heart tissue. This increased load can cause the heart muscle cells to enlarge as they try and cope with the new demands. However, eventually a point can be reached where even after the muscle cells have become larger, it's still not enough to deal with the extra load. If this happens, then unfortunately cardiac failure occurs. This shows hypertrophy of cardiac muscle in heart disease. Notice over here we've got a normal heart, showing you the ventricles here, and we have a cardiac muscle cell from within this normal heart. On this side here, however, we have the heart from somebody who's suffering valve problems. There's been narrowing of the heart valve. So as a consequence, the heart must pump harder to force the blood through into the arteries. Notice how the walls of the ventricles of the diseased heart have become much thicker. This thickening is due largely to the enlargement of individual cardiac muscle cells, as seen on this image. As I said before, there's a limit to how far this process can progress before the heart fails. A third form of cellular adaptation is hyperplasia. It refers to increased numbers of cells as a consequence of increased cellular division. And that's what we've got represented in this image here. Here we have the original state of the tissue, and then when the tissue exhibits hyperplasia, we can see there's an increase in the numbers of cells present due to increased cellular division. Hyperplasia is not necessarily indicative of disease. It may be an entirely normal process. For example, the lining of the uterus exhibits lots of cell division during the menstrual cycle. This is under hormonal control. Compensatory hyperplasia is also a normal process that occurs to help with the replacement of lost or damaged tissues. However, pathological hyperplasia may occur in cases where there is abnormalities in hormonal mechanisms that regulate cell growth. This slide is summarizing some of the concepts that I've just mentioned. Firstly, we have physiological hypoplasia. It does not represent disease. It can allow an organ to recover if it's damaged, or it may be part of a normal hormone mechanism. Hyperplasia, though, may indicate disease. That's pathologic hyperplasia. This may occur in response to hormonal imbalances or infections. Hyperplasia has a number of possible outcomes, such as increased performance of the organ or an increased risk for some cancers. In this slide, I'll discuss an example of pathological hyperplasia. That's benign prostatic hyperplasia. The prostate gland is in the male. It's an accessory sex gland that's located inferior to the bladder. It makes secretions that contribute to the semen. From about the ages of 20 to 45, the prostate gland stays basically the same size. In later life, however, it starts growing slowly again, particularly around where the urethra is. By the age of 70, 90% of males will have some evidence of benign enlargement of the prostate gland. It's not cancer, but it can cause problems. Enlargement of the prostate in particular can obstruct the flow of urine through the urethra. This can lead to chronic urine intention and increased risk of kidney infections. This shows the condition of benign prostatic hyperplasia. Here we have a sagittal section of the male pelvis. Note the penis, the testes, urinary bladder, and the prostate gland located here. In cases of benign prostatic hyperplasia, there is enlargement of this gland, and this enlarged area is noted here, the red shaded section. Enlargement of the prostate gland will have the potential to obstruct the flow of urine through the urethra. This can lead to bladder and kidney infections. Unfortunately, it's not possible to reverse benign prostatic hyperplasia enlargement. However, if required, the tissue can be removed surgically or a catheter can be inserted to allow the urine flow to begin again. The adaptive condition of metaplasia refers to a reversible replacement of one normal cell type with another normal cell type. So in this image here, we have a simple cuboidal epithelium being replaced by another normal epithelial cell type, in this case a stratified epithelium. A key fact is that this cell here is normal and these cells here are also normal. However, in metaplasia, the new cell type that's found in the organ is present in a location where normally it should not be present. The new cell type should also be more able to resist the stress that the organ is being put under. So a key thing to remember is that in metaplasia you are swapping one normal cell type for another normal cell type. A classic example of metaplasia can be seen in the airways. In smokers, constant exposure to cigarette smoke can lead to replacement of the simple epithelium lining the airways with a tougher stratified epithelium. However, the consequence of this is that the stratified epithelium lacks the ability to produce mucus or remove the dust and bacteria that tends to accumulate in the airways, and this can lead to a number of problems, as I'll speak of soon. This shows metaplasia in the respiratory system, so we might be looking here at the lining of the trachea or the bronchi. Normally these structures are lined by a simple layer of columnar epithelial cells. These cells will typically have cilia on the apical surface. The cilia brush dust and mucus away that tends to accumulate in the airways. Now, if someone's a heavy smoker, however, these epithelial cells are replaced often with a stratified squamous epithelium. These new cells lack the cilia that the original cells had. So the dust and bacteria and the mucus tends to accumulate. This can result in the person who's got this condition having a hacking cough. It's reversible, but if the offending agent is not removed, it may eventually progress to a tumour state. The final type of adaptation I'll mention is dysplasia. This is closely related to hyperplasia and is sometimes called atypical hyperplasia. The term literally means disordered growth and is characterized by a very disorganized, higgledy-piggledy appearance in the tissue. The cells will appear very different from one another, and in particular many of them will have large abnormal nuclei. This condition is encountered mostly in epithelial tissues. So basically over here we've got the normal cells, simple cuboidal epithelium, and in a condition of dysplasia we get a jumble of abnormal looking cells, many of which have unusually large nuclei. In some cases, this dysplasia can be considered a pre-invasive form of a tumour. However, it does not always have to progress to cancer. So we've just spoken about how cells try to respond to changes by undergoing different adaptive responses. These adaptations, however, don't always work. Failure to adapt may result in cell death. Necrosis is a term that relates to a particular type of cell death. and this term is largely related to the impact of degenerative enzymes on the injured cells. Another type of cell death is apoptosis. It's, however, a much more orderly process than necrosis, and in fact may represent a normal process of development. So that last statement I made was particularly important. Apoptosis is a type of cell death that is essential for several key developmental processes. A good example of this is the loss of the tail that occurs in a tadpole as it changes into a frog. Here we've got a tadpole starting to show the early signs of changing into a frog, and as that change progresses, you'll notice the tail shrinks and eventually disappears. The shrinkage is caused to this highly ordered form of cell death. A key feature of apoptosis is that, unlike necrosis, this cell death does not cause any inflammation in the affected tissue. By contrast, necrosis is not part of any normal developmental program. It occurs in response to unintended cell death. Here are some of the key characteristics of necrosis: swelling of the cell and organelles, rupture of the membrane, breakdown of the cellular organelles by enzymes, fragmentation of the nucleus, and inflammation in the adjacent tissues. Eventually, a cell such as a macrophage or a neutrophil will come along and engulf and destroy the necrotic cell. This shows some of the key processes associated with the type of cell death that we call necrosis. Early indications are swelling of the cell and the cellular membranes. This will eventually progress to the point where the cell membranes rupture and the cell contents are digested by internal enzymes. You also get fragmentation of the nucleus. A key consequence of necrosis is that the cell contents leak into the nearby tissues and can cause inflammation. Eventually, the cell will be destroyed by phagocytes that wander through the tissues, such as macrophages or neutrophils. This is an example of necrosis. It's called gangrene. Over here we have gas gangrene. This is often seen in infections with a bacteria called Clostridium or other soil-borne bacteria. Note the gas production that's occurring here. On this side we've got dry gangrene. This has been caused by frostbite. As the structure here has been frozen, there's been impaired blood flow. The affected part is dry, shrunken and dark black, resembling mummified flesh. The dark coloration is due to the liberation of hemoglobin from destroyed red blood cells. In this section of the lecture, I'll talk about neoplasia. This literally means the process of new growth, and in particular it relates to how tumours form. In some cases, tumours can become cancers that will spread throughout the body. This shows a colonic polyp, that's a benign glandular tumour that we find in the large intestine. So, neoplasia, that is, tumours. All neoplasia have abnormal, non-functional tissue. Other key features of neoplasia are that the growth that is occurring in an uncontrolled manner, and there is a loss of normal cellular function. Tumours will have two basic components to them. They'll have the neoplastic cells, and they'll also have a supporting stroma, which is composed primarily of connective tissue and blood vessels. The suffix "oma" is used to indicate a tumour. Another important concept to mention is that in some cases tumours can spread or metastasize well beyond where they originate, and this spread typically occurs through the blood vessels or the lymphatic system. The origin of most tumours is a multi-step process. Now, normally cell division in tissues is a tightly regulated process that is set up to meet the demands of the tissue. Here we have an image where that process is broken down. We have here in a tissue a situation where a cell has acquired a mutation in its genes, and this mutation allows the cells to create more cells in the tissue than it should. It may divide faster or it may last longer than it should. An imbalance now exists between cell production and cell loss. Further mutations can then occur, and at least one of the cells here, we can see it indicated there, has undergone a transformation event which now allows it to begin to form a tumour. In some cases, further mutations may occur, allowing the tumour to invade local tissues, for example by penetrating the basement membrane. At this point, it may be able to spread to distant sites and form additional tumours. Tumours are classified according to several criteria. A key criteria is how they behave. Firstly, there are the benign tumours. They lack the invasive properties that we associate with cancers. However, they still can produce negative health effects due to the compression of tissue in the surrounding area or the production of excess hormones. Malignant tumours, commonly referred to as cancers, have the capacity to spread beyond the original tumour site. This is where they undergo metastasis. Very important definitions there. Benign, stay in one place. Malignant can spread. This shows an example of a benign tumour. It's warts, in this case caused by the human papilloma virus. They're common lesions associated with adolescence. Getting these usually involves direct contact with an infected individual. They can initially be confused with calluses. Now, under the microscope, the warts appear to have fairly normal cellular appearances. It looks like normal skin, and it doesn't spread. So that's a benign neoplasm. Still some evidence of normal tissue structure. When classifying tissues, reference can also be made to the tissue of origin. Tumours may arise from mesenchyme, which is a loosely organised, undifferentiated type of tissue that gives rise to such structures as connective tissues, blood, lymphatics, bone and cartilage. A myoma indicates an origin from muscle tissue, fibroma from connective tissue, lipoma from adipose tissue. Neoplasms may also originate from epithelial origins. Papilloma is a neoplasm that arises from surface epithelium. Those that arise from glandular epithelium are termed adenoma. And a polyp, we've mentioned that briefly before, it's a dome-shaped benign neoplasm of the covering or lining epithelia. This slide here, we can see a neoplasm which originates from glandular epithelium. It's an adenoma. It's from the adrenal gland epithelium. This neoplasm produces cortisol. That's a stress-related hormone that influences glucose metabolism. Excess production of cortisol from this tumour can cause Cushing's syndrome, which I mentioned briefly when I did the endocrine lecture. Lipoma, which we see here, is a benign tumour of fat cells. It's the most common soft tissue tumour in adulthood. Here you have a well-encapsulated mass of adipocytes. Those are fat cells. It's soft, mobile, and normally quite painless, simply cured by excision through surgery. Unfortunately, sometimes tumours develop the potential to invade surrounding tissues and spread throughout the body. When this happens, they are called malignant tumours, derived from the Latin for bad. These are the ones that are referred to as cancers. Here are some characteristics of malignant neoplasms. Like all neoplasms, they demonstrate uncontrolled growth. However, these malignant neoplasms bear little resemblance to the cells of origin, unlike the benign ones. Malignant neoplasms have the capacity to spread or metastasize to other areas via the lymphatic and the blood vessels. Another characteristic of these tumours is that they promote angiogenesis, that is the formation of new blood vessels to supply the tumour with the necessary nutrients and oxygen for it to keep growing. This shows a comparison of benign and malignant tumours. What we're looking at here are tumours of muscle in the wall of the uterus. There's one there and there's one there. Notice the big differences in the gross appearance of these tumours and also the histology of these tumours. That's the cellular structure of them. Notice here on this side the benign tumour. It's localized. Over here we have the malignant tumour, And what is obvious is that it's spreading into the adjacent tissue. Now have a look at the histology, or the appearance of the tissue under the microscope. The appearance of the benign tumour is relatively normal looking, so it would be difficult to distinguish this from normal smooth muscle in the wall of the uterus. On this side here, however, the malignant tumour, the tissue histology appears abnormal. This shows some of the terms we use to classify malignant tumours. Those that arise from many endothelial or epithelial tissues are referred to as carcinomas. Those that arise from glandular or ductal epithelium are referred to as adenocarcinoma. If a malignant neoplasm arises from mesenchymal, the connective tissues, that's referred to as a sarcoma. If a malignancy arises from the cells responsible for creating new blood cells, that's referred to as a leukemia. And a lymphoma is a malignant neoplasm that arises from lymphoid tissue. It's a cancer of the immune system. This shows a carcinoma spreading through the lungs. Note how there appears to be progression through the lymphatic system. You can see here carbon deposits. That's associated with smoking. Now, unfortunately, lung cancer is the most frequently diagnosed major cancer in the world, and the most common cause of this cancer is smoking. If possible, I will try to present to you in one of the tutorials this exact specimen for you to look at more closely. In this slide, we've discussed some of the key points associated with how malignant tumours spread beyond their site of origin. First, cells in the tumour must possess the capacity to penetrate the basement membrane of their tissue and invade the surrounding tissues. The main route of further spread is then via the lymphatic system, but it can also involve the cardiovascular system. A very important concept is that malignant tumours can seed new secondary tumours throughout the body. This slide is a good example of how malignant tumours metastasize. See here we have a primary tumour. It's growing and it's also triggering the growth of blood vessels as it grows. Eventually it will invade the local tissues and escape into the lymphatic or venous system. It then spreads throughout the body until it reaches an organ where it lodges. It will then adhere to the blood vessel walls and spread into the organ tissue. It will release local factors to trigger blood vessel growth, whereupon it will form additional tumours in the new organ. This slide summarises some of the basic characteristics of the benign and the malignant neoplasms. So we'll just refresh ourselves on that. Benign tumours typically have slow growth. Malignant tumours, however, grow rapidly. Benign tumours are typically covered by a capsule. Malignant tumours lack a capsule. The appearance of cells within a benign tumour can appear relatively normal. That's not the case in malignant tumours. Perhaps one of the most significant differences between these types of neoplasms is that benign tumours lack the capacity to spread, to metastasize, whereas malignant tumours are capable of spreading to distant locations. As a consequence of this characteristic, the prognosis for benign tumours is often quite good, unlike that of many malignant tumours. Tumours can have a range of impacts on those suffering from them. For example, as I've mentioned before, compression of the tissue can disturb local organ functions as the tumours grow. For example, the pituitary tumour, if it gets a tumour in it, that can press on the optic nerve, causing blindness. Malignant tumours present additional problems. For example, they can cause ulceration due to a loss of surface epithelium. You can also get infarction or death of tissue due to obstruction of blood vessels as the tumour spreads. And reduced food intake is probably the major cause of continuing weight loss in patients suffering from cancers, that's malignant neoplasms. This shows the impact of a tumour on a host at the local level. So here we have a tumour which originates from the meninges, that's the connective tissue lining of the brain. You can see that it's pressed down on the brain tissue, causing atrophy. That's where the white arrow is here. So atrophy in this structure has been caused by the pressure exhibited by the tumour. So in the previous slide we saw a local effect of a tumour. Tumours can also have distant or systemic effects. This shows one good example of that. This is a condition of acromegaly or giantism in this individual here. This is a consequence of excessive hormone production from a tumour of the anterior pituitary, which produces growth hormone. So as a consequence of this excessive growth hormone, this person has become much larger than normal. Unfortunately, this condition is associated with many complications such as an enlarged heart, hypertension, kidney failure, diabetes and arthritis. In the last couple of slides, I'll just finish up with some basic terminology. The term carcinogens you may have heard of. These are substances that can have an effect on the genes, resulting in abnormal cell production, and they can lead to the appearance of cancers. Carcinogens include certain viruses, bacteria, many chemicals. Environmental carcinogens include things such as ionizing radiation, and there are many lifestyle issues too which are able to promote the formation of cancers. Smoking, obesity, alcohol, animal fats, UV light are just some of them. In this slide we'll just finish up with a couple more terms. 3 here are probably the 3 most important. Definition of a neoplasm: it's a tumour, and that is simply an abnormal growth of tissue. That is not cancer. A malignant tumour, however, can invade and destroy nearby tissue, and it's capable of spreading or metastasizing to other locations. That's what we refer to as a cancer. Metastasis is the process by which the tumour spreads. Other terms that may be relevant to cancer that you may need to know about: oncology, that relates to cancer, where we will have, for example, oncology wards in the hospital that are specialised for the treatment of cancers. The term remission indicates that the cancer and its symptoms are not detectable. Unfortunately, if you have a relapse, this is where the cancer and its symptoms are now detectable again. That concludes today's lecture.